Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. So I'm Gwen, part of the Secretariat team at SFA. So today's webinar is co-hosted alongside with Government of Canada's Trade Commission Service, and we'll be hearing from Ms Suhuyini about Canada's fintech ecosystem, opportunities in their market, regulations, and the government support. Ms Suhuyini is Government of Canada Investment Champion Speaker for SFF 2024 and a partner at Borden Ladner Gervais. Without further ado, I'll just pass it on to her. And if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to drop the questions at the Q&A function below at your Zoom. Ms. Suhuyini, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. I almost said good evening, as it is evening for me here in Canada. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for this webinar, where we'll be discussing, or rather I'll be presenting, and I hope you have some questions on the state of fintech in Canada. I'm going to share my screen so you can see the slides, and the slides will be available after the presentation. I'll circulate them to SFF so we can get those to you. Just confirm you can see the slides.
Yes, but not full screen.
Perfect, thank you. And only the slides. Okay, great. Yeah, so I'll skip that there. For our agenda today, we're going to cover at a high level, as we've got a short period of time. Everything okay? Audio fine?
Sorry,
Video
I
fine?
think you're still seeing your PowerPoint, not the full screen.
Oh, you're not seeing it, or you?
No, we're not seeing it. As in, we do see your PowerPoint, but not the full screen.
Okay, let me try that again. I did the right share. Let's see it one more time. Entire screen. Let me see.
Yes, we do now.
Okay, good, perfect. Thank you. Great. So yes, as mentioned, I'm a partner at Borden Ladner Gervais LLP, BLG. We are Canada's largest law firm in that we have offices in all of the relevant jurisdictions here in Canada. And my practice focuses on the regulation of financial services in Canada, with a particular emphasis on our consumer protection laws. And today we're going to be addressing at a high level, given the time, we're going to be talking about why in terms of fintech companies who are looking to grow and expand outside of their current jurisdiction. We will touch on innovation in the financial services sector here in Canada, the support for foreign investors in Canada, both from the government and the private sector, and some regulatory highlights, as there are many developments on the regulatory front here in Canada across our different provinces and federal laws. And for those of you who are well versed on our system, I hope I don't insult you, but I'm going to just give a high level overview on Canada, as where we are positioned in North America. As I'm sure you are familiar, we are near the United States, so we're in North America, and Canada is comprised of 10 provinces and 3 territories. And I will briefly touch on the legal framework because our laws are a mix of federal and provincial laws and territorial laws, and they apply to different types of entities as well as different types of industries and goods and services that are being provided to Canadians. But initially, just to take a step back and talk, discuss the state of fintech in Canada and why fintech companies expand into Canada. I often advise companies who are entering the Canadian market from the United States and also outside of North America, who want to understand what are the laws that are going to apply to the products and services that they're going to be providing to Canadians? What's the regulatory framework? What's the climate? But also relevant when a business is operating in a jurisdiction is you want to ensure that it's there's certain elements that are satisfied. And I believe, I've got a bias because I am here in Canada and I'm very proud to be a Canadian. But the facts and the statistics speak for themselves, in the sense that we have a very strong and sound financial system, and that was evident in the most recent financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, where you saw the resiliency of our banking sector, which bank revenues are significant for our GDP. So we have a very strong and stable financial system. And when it comes to information technology and the communication sector, that too is also strong, and it is growing as there's interest and a movement on the fintech side, which we'll talk about as we go through the presentation. We have one of the highest employment and population growth rates among the G7 countries. And in terms of fintech and the regulatory developments, we're also the first country in the world to have a national AI strategy. And I think that's really relevant because, like it or not, and I say that because from the perspective of being a lawyer, there's talk of some of the things we do being replaced by AI, although I hope that the regulatory analysis cannot be replaced by AI. So there's some functions that will remain, but AI is a key topic of conversation among businesses and also the government. And so I think that's very valuable that we have a government that recognizes that this is a development that is going to progress and it's going to impact industries. And so therefore, they're looking at ensuring that Canada has the appropriate framework in place, right, to make sure that they're appropriate resources, but also some guardrails and safeguards for businesses and for consumers. When it comes to expanding into Canada, oftentimes U.S. I'll speak about it from the North America perspective, given where I'm based. But U.S. companies, a lot of large U.S. companies will usually start, which could make sense since we're their neighbors. They'll start within Canada, and that's not necessarily just because of the geographical location, but it is because we're a good place to do business in terms of our population and our economy, and also the appetite of consumers here. This is a fintech, I'd say, maybe several years ago, there were some, concerns about how that would look here in Canada, because we have, for instance, when we're talking about fintech companies are going to be expected to be not necessarily competitors of the banks, because a lot of them have partnerships with the banks, which I'll talk about, but we do have a smaller number of banks compared to other jurisdictions, so such as the US. And then there's also talk of our top 5 or top 6 banks, but that's not to say that there is not opportunity here in Canada, and that's being demonstrated by the rapid pace of growth in terms of fintech companies coming into Canada, and also our governmental response, which also demonstrates this growth, which is these regulatory frameworks that are being put in place to catch up with this area. So we'll talk briefly about that as we move along with the presentation. But in our ecosystem here in Canada, the top areas include payments, and that's key. Money moves through different institutions and businesses, right? It's not just traditional banks, financial institutions who are moving money now. We have the concept of money services businesses, payment services providers, and even outside of that, there are a number of businesses who maybe that's not their primary purpose, especially within the fintech space. The primary purpose is not to move money and funds, but they would still fall within the payments bucket just because of the fact that payments touches upon everything. There's lending, of course. We have seen a lot of the buy now pay later companies who are coming into Canada, and I'll probably use a couple of them. There are a couple of prominent ones who have assisted in terms of expanding into Canada, and I'll use them maybe as a case example toward the end, just so you can see or hear about how it actually maybe works, in terms of coming into this jurisdiction. Back office support, and that's also not just for private companies, but in particular also our financial institutions, digital currencies, foreign exchange, and personal finance management. These are the top areas in the fintech ecosystem. They're some of the top areas in the fintech ecosystem. And as I mentioned, fintech has been adopted here in Canada at a rapid pace, and there are several fintech hubs across the country. Toronto, Ontario has one of the largest, and then in Calgary in Alberta on the West Coast, Vancouver has in British Columbia, also on the West Coast, and then Montreal. And these fintech hubs provide, among other matters, they provide resources to help. The fintech hubs provide resources to help fintechs grow and build and get to scale here in Canada. And then finally, we have investment, I mentioned, from the private sector and the government. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide with respect to what that looks like. And this is just a graphic. I won't go into too much detail here, but this is just continuing to illustrate our fintech ecosystem with respect to the different areas that it touches upon. So payroll, wealth management, personal finance, payments, digital currencies, RegTech, lending, capital markets, real estate. It's similar in the jurisdictions that I'm sure that you're all in, right? This is fintech. The ecosystems are similar. And finally, just this slide just has an example of some of the fintechs who are currently operating in Canada. And it's not just the fintech. So this is a handful because there are thousands, but these are probably some names that maybe you may be familiar with. And it's not only fintechs, because you'll see that we've got some of our banks listed here. And that's just to illustrate the partnership between the banks and the fintechs, which I'll talk about as we move on. So a number of fintechs providing different solutions and services, right, for accounting, lending, buy now, pay later, open banking, so data scraping, which I will touch upon. Innovation in the financial services sector here in Canada. So in terms of key developments, we're looking at 4 areas, and this is not to say this is an exhaustive list, but these are some key areas of development when it comes to innovation in Canada with respect to fintech. And consumer behavior, the regulatory environment, access to capital and funding, and partnerships are all relevant. When it comes to consumer behavior, I'd mentioned that, several years ago, there may have been somewhat of a hesitancy to move away from our traditional providers of financial services, just because of the nature of the banking system here in Canada. As I mentioned, it's a very strong banking system, and the banks are trusted. But we've seen, I call it sometimes that we live in a prime world, in the sense that for those, who use Amazon Prime, you're so, you get used to, whatever it is you're ordering, it may come the next day, right? Or it's a couple of day window before the delivery is made. Whereas, before we had this concept of, this online marketplace with Amazon Prime and other businesses, you'd wait weeks, right, for your order to be delivered. So as consumers living in a prime world, there's this desire to have, whatever our needs are satisfied almost instantaneously, right? If I'm making a payment, I want that to clear instantly. If I'm receiving a payment, I want that to clear instantly. And I'll talk about our developments when it comes to payments in Canada, as we are moving to build a real-time payment system to facilitate payments that traditionally take days to clear. So being in a prime world, consumers want things instantly. And so this is also driving the push to embracing financial technology and fintechs. And as you saw on that previous slide, there are a number of fintech companies who are expanding into the Canadian market. And I don't, outside of, my focus is going to be on the legal landscape, right, which is relevant. But these businesses make that decision from outside of our regulatory environment, right? So they've done the analysis with respect to what Canada has to offer, and then they come to us to say, okay, how do we go live here? So consumer behavior, the regulatory environment is favorable in the sense that we have strong a sound legal system, and I mentioned their federal and provincial laws, which I'll touch upon. But when it comes to the regulatory environment, for me, the fact that the government the legislatures, the legislatures and the provinces and federally, they are attuned to these issues and these developments, and therefore you'll see the introduction of new laws to regulate some of the elements of fintech. But at the same time, there's also a collaborative approach. So, for instance, you may be familiar with there was a class action, a suit filed against the payment card network operators, so including Visa and MasterCard. And when it comes to surcharging, the card network rules are generally a matter of private contract. And with respect to surcharging, the rules differ in each jurisdiction. And so there was a class action concerning the surcharges here in Canada, and a settlement was reached. And rather than the Canadian government or the lawmakers, enacting a law to regulate the surcharging, which is the case in other jurisdictions, including the U.S. It was a collaborative approach, which was that the payment card network operators agreed to amend their rules to address permitting surcharging in Canada. And so that's just very important, I think, also because it just shows that collaboration of the government. Like, laws are not meant to be, we need laws, like they have to exist for a reason. Of course, I'm biased for saying that as I'm a lawyer, but laws are necessary for us to function in this society. And the laws, sometimes companies coming into a new jurisdiction, especially when you're not familiar with the regulatory environment, can feel a bit like, how stringent are these laws, in terms of questions that they would raise. They're concerned about that. But I think it's key to see that the regulators and the lawmakers are amenable to having a collaborative approach to regulate these matters. Another example of that is we have a payment card network. It's a code of conduct, and that's probably actually a good one to illustrate the collaborative nature of some aspects of our laws, because this applies to all the payment card networks and their participants. So the acquiring banks, the payment services providers, right? So it has wide reach. It applies to businesses, so merchants. And it was another example of where the government could have legislated and enacted laws, but rather permitted the industry to adopt this voluntary code. So all the participants, including the payment card networks, abide by the code, and your merchant agreements and disclosures need to also abide by the code's requirements in terms of, a fee summary box, so that merchants can see what the fees are for, certain types of cards and what their restrictions may be. So that's clear to the merchants. So it's a voluntary code in that, if they didn't do the code, then if they hadn't enacted the code, then likely this area would be regulated by a law. But notwithstanding that, the implementation of the code was fairly smooth. And there's a new version of the code that's actually being issued and released in October to modernize certain elements of it. Access to capital and funding, very important, especially when we're dealing with startups. And that also impacts, even legal advice, because sometimes the analysis can take some time, and it can also end up being quite costly because of the nature of the nature of how some entities are structured before they're entering into the Canadian market, and then also the nature of their products and services. FinTech by and one of the key elements of fintech is this idea that we're disrupting, the traditional financial services sector, and also the traditional providers of financial services, so such as the banks. However, that also means that the laws are not the laws need to catch up to address some of the innovative products and services that some of the companies who are entering the market are trying to offer to Canadians. And that's often part of the analysis when a company is coming into Canada, which is, what is your product? What is the product, or what is the service that you're offering? And how is that structured? And you'll sometimes have to, where the intent is not for them to be caught by a certain type of law. So for instance, payday lending or high cost credit, which is a new regime, a somewhat new regime over the last 5 or 6 years in some of the provinces, which regulates, I call them so they're plain vanilla loans, right? We have those. And then when it comes to high cost credit, it's loans that have an interest rate that is a certain percentage. It's about 32% in some provinces and 22% in others. But once you trigger and you exceed that rate, it's considered to be a high cost credit loan. And then their disclosure and licensing requirements that are required. So when it comes to startups and this types of, having to get set up here and the legal advice, I think for those who are practicing in this space, you're well aware of that and you're mindful of that. And then in terms of access to capital and funding, there are different government programs. One of the prominent ones in Canada, and when I first started practicing about 16 years ago, I did some lending transactions, and I did a lot of work actually with Canada's. We have call it SHRED. It's a SHRED program, but it's scientific research and experimental development tax incentives. And so they're tax incentives that are intended to encourage businesses to conduct research and development in Canada. So different types of corporate entities can may be eligible if you meet the eligibility criteria to receive this tax incentive. And there are a number of financial institutions that actually would fund businesses on these tax credits that will be coming in. Then obviously once the tax credit comes in, business would provide that payment to the lender. So there are options, and there are other government programs for specific industries as well. And then we also have the traditional, the banks, private lenders, venture capital, seed capital, and other types of debt and equity transactions with access to the capital markets. When it comes to acquisitions, there are a number of fintechs that I work with who and everybody has their own vision or desire for what they want to see the company do and how it grows. And there's some who have a desire to have the company acquired. So there's acquisition financing, and then there are also some corporate tax benefits as well, depending on how the entity is structured when you enter the Canadian market. Finally, I just wanted to mention one last governmental incentive here, which is the National Research Council of Canada Industrial Research Assistance Program. So this is the NRC IRAP, so NRC IRAP, and it's a leading innovation assistance program for small and medium-sized businesses in Canada. And also in connection with the reference that I made earlier to Canada having this, being the first country to have this AI national strategy, our most recent federal budget committed billions of dollars to assist fintech, it's fintech, but to assist AI startups in terms of, bringing to market their new technologies and assisting them, small and medium-sized businesses to scale up, as well as there's also one element of the budget plan for AI, which I really appreciate, is we're not only forward-looking in terms of looking at what AI is going to do, but as I mentioned before, when I talked about, how AI may replace some of what we do, maybe even as lawyers and other businesses, is that the government is mindful of that. And so part of the proposal is to create some funding and programs for workers who may be impacted by AI. Sorry, I see. Oh, I thought I saw something in the chat. Apologies. So there's funding to take care of those who may be left behind, right, with the development of AI, and I think that's very important. And lastly, we've got this Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, which is proposed to aim to guide AI innovation in Canada. And then lastly on the slide, partnerships. So I mentioned before that there are partnerships between the fintechs and the banks. So our banks are federally regulated financial institutions, and they're subject to a different set of laws than fintechs. Although now we're seeing, because of the nature of the products and services that fintechs are providing, that there's some application of some of the requirements to them. That said, we had amendments to there were recent amendments, by recent, I mean in the last 5 years, to our federal banking legislation to allow our banks and other federally regulated financial entities, such as insurance companies, to allow them to enter into arrangements with fintechs. Prior to that, there were some restrictions on that, which to maybe try and simplify what can be a quite complex analysis under a Bank Act. There are restrictions that would require the bank to hold or acquire the entity that it's entering into these types of arrangements with. And so these restrictions have been lifted, so to speak, to permit the financial institutions such as the banks to enter into arrangements with fintechs, and also for referral fees from these entities to be permitted, as that was also restricted before. So one of the most recent announcements of partnership actually was last week, and that was of interest to me because I was just at an American Bar Association conference in San Diego presenting on this topic, which is earned wage access. And so you may recall I mentioned before that a business may structure its product in a certain manner and then find out, well, because of the nature of how you've structured this, you actually fall within this type of a regulatory framework. So payday loans, for example. So when it comes to earned wage access, which is very hotly debated in the US right now, but that's, and for those who don't know, it's essentially programs that advance an employee's earned wages to them prior to payday. And that may be done by the employer, or often there's a third party. So a fintech, there's a third party in that mix. And so last week, one of our top 5 banks announced a partnership. It's the first in Canada, and so very interesting, with an earned wage access provider. And this is the first of its kind here in Canada. And I say that's an interesting development because I think that further strengthens the point that I've made about the fact that there's these partnerships and there's this openness and openness to having fintechs coming into Canada, notwithstanding, yes, there's some competition between the fintechs and the banks, but you're definitely seeing some partnerships and some novel ones at that. Just lastly, I won't talk too much here because somewhat covered this, but these are other key areas for innovation in financial services in Canada, and they're probably relevant maybe in your jurisdictions as well, just thinking of the way financial services has evolved over recent years. So AI, fraud, and cybersecurity are very it's a very I guess key issue for not just the fintechs, but other businesses and also financial institutions who are operating here in Canada. And we're going to see, I think, a lot of developments in that space, especially because of the sophistication of some of the scams, which, I've unfortunately, I've not sent any money, but I was telling some colleagues how I got a text message about a parking ticket, and it was not my parking ticket, but I thought I did know that we had a parking ticket for one of for the car, and I started to, I had made the mistake. I clicked on the link and it actually looked like a legitimate website for our municipal authority. And it was when I saw the harassing language that was used, the text to pay the parking ticket, that I clued in that this, because I know that, they can't, there's certain business practices when you're collecting. So I clued in at the last minute, but all that to say that the scams are very sophisticated, and they can impact anybody. And when it comes to fraud and cybersecurity, I would just mention briefly too that even the banks are looking closely at this, because one of our big five banks, we were talking about how the schemes are so sophisticated, in the sense that you can receive a phone call sometimes from an individual impersonating a bank representative, but they're listing transactions that you actually made, and therefore you are led to believe that this person is the bank, because who else would know about these transactions? So fraud and cybersecurity are key areas where we'll probably see additional regulatory developments and oversight. Cloud computing, reg tech, open banking, consumer-driven finance, and real-time payments, I'll talk about briefly in the next couple of slides. I won't go into detail here on this slide, be mindful of time, and this is just an overview of some of the support for foreign investors that I mentioned before, and this will be provided in the slides, and happy to provide additional information as well, or links to some of these governmental programs and sites, and also the FinTech hubs if you'd like. Now, the fun stuff, at least for me. Not that that wasn't fun before. I enjoyed that, but since this is what I do daily, I just wanted to give you an overview of the legal framework as it's relevant to a business, such as a FinTech, of course, coming into, in particular, FinTech, because there are some unique laws that would apply coming into Canada. I mentioned that we have the 10 provinces and 3 territories, and then there's the federal government. So, excuse me, sorry. Something in my throat. Our regulatory framework is this division of powers. So there are certain matters that are under federal jurisdiction, and there are matters that are under provincial jurisdiction. And when it comes to FinTech, it's a bit of a mix because of the fact that there are federal laws that would apply. So when it comes to criminal rates of interest, so usury, and when it comes to copyright, IP, and other matters, we're falling under the federal umbrella. Banking is traditionally a matter of our federal jurisdiction. And I only mention this overview of our legal framework because there is this tension sometimes between our federal and provincial laws because of this division of powers, and the fact that banking is considered to be a matter of federal jurisdiction. But we have case law that has addressed that in terms of stating that our provincial consumer protection laws apply to banks. And this is relevant just because of the fact that there's this a wide array of laws that would apply to a company that's entering the Canadian market and who is in the FinTech sector. So it's just relevant to understand what the legal framework looks like when you're here. And here we've got a list of some of the key regulators who have oversight over the sector. The Bank of Canada. I'm not going to actually read through the slide because I'll share it with you. But this just gives you a picture of the types of regulators. They're federal and they're provincial, and they touch upon particular areas such as anti-money laundering, consumer protection, and securities, so our private or capital markets, and privacy. Okay. And here we have just an overview of some of the laws. And I apologize, I caught a little typo here where I referred to consumer driven finance. It's consumer driven finance. which is what Canada is using to refer to open banking. Excuse me, as consumer-driven finance. So I won't read through this because I will share the slides, but this will just give you a snapshot of the types of laws that may apply on the federal side and the provincial side when entering the Canadian market. And just be mindful of time so we can do questions. I wanted to give you just a brief update on some of the developments here in Canada that may impact financial technology company entering the market. So I mentioned before that our criminal rate of interest, our usury rates are federal, excuse me, and right now, if you exceed an annual interest rate of 60%, that is a criminal rate of interest. However, there are amendments to our criminal code, which is the federal law where this requirement is contained. The amendments are going to change the criminal rate of interest from exceeding a 60% annual rate to lower it to if you're exceeding an annual percentage rate, so an APR of 35%. So this is a significant development here in Canada, and there was since it impacts commercial and consumer, primarily consumer, there's going to be some requirements for businesses operating to amend their practices going forward when it comes to, credit underwriting, and then also their documentation. And this new rate is expected to be in effect in early January. Excuse me. When it comes to the provinces, Ontario, so thinking of the sizes of our provinces and consumers, often when fintechs come into Canada, they're looking at Ontario, out west as well, BC and Alberta, and then Quebec, which is a different legal system than the rest of Canada. We've got the common law in we're the common law in all the provinces and territories, but for Quebec, which is the civil code, so civil law, and they have a unique legal system. Sometimes, and there's also French language requirements. So sometimes when a company is coming into Canada, we'll talk about, focusing on Ontario and other jurisdictions first, and then addressing Quebec just because of the unique requirements there. But depending on the business, what their strategy is and their appetite, sometimes they'll do it concurrently. But just to note that if you're looking to have a harmonized set of documentation, that's possible, yes, but oftentimes that contract is going to look a lot different, and any consumer-facing terms, or even when you're dealing with businesses in Quebec, the agreements will defer to comply with the requirements of their civil law and the French language requirements. That said, Ontario is one of the bigger provinces, and often included when a business is coming into Canada. And Ontario's Consumer Protection Act is being amended. So there's an existing act that will be repealed and a new act, which we are waiting for regulations, which will contain the substance of the law. A new act will be enacted. And I referred to it in the slide just because of the position of Ontario when it comes to the fintech sector and the impact of these amendments, because it's going to be a new act, which is actually favorable because the act hasn't been updated since I think it was like maybe almost 20 years ago. So we're modernizing it. So this is a good thing. And then open banking, consumer-driven banking, which is essentially open banking here in Canada. We are moving forward with that. We've got a Consumer-Driven Banking Act, which establishes the framework to allow open banking in Canada. Not that it's not allowed, because it is taking place now, because there are a number of fintechs who are providing those services in terms of scraping consumers' data and sharing that information, but there are no laws that are regulating that. And as you can imagine, that can be problematic, especially from the perspective of the financial institution, because me as a consumer permitting a third party to view my account and access it is likely violating the terms of my account agreement. So this is good that we're enacting laws now to address that. And so we're seeing a lot of movement there. And I think once the law is in place too, I think that's also going to further the growth of the fintech sector in Canada. And lastly, the Retail Payments Activities Act, which is a new regime in Canada, and it applies to payment services providers. And payment services providers are you're considered to be a PSP if you are performing any one of 5 functions, so such as holding funds, directing the movement of funds. So there are 5 functions. You meet any one of them. Absent any exemption, the entity needs to register with our Bank of Canada. That's our central bank, who's going to have oversight of this regime. And then there are a number of other requirements, such as safeguarding funds, and other frameworks that need to be implemented. And this requirement to register with the Bank of Canada, it takes effect in early November. So a busy time for us and many developments. I'm sorry, excuse me, I don't know what got caught in my throat there. I apologize. But a busy time because there are many developments, and I think regulatory developments are indicative of the focus on this sector, which is not a bad thing, but it shows that there is this growth here in Canada when it comes to fintechs. And that concludes my presentation and overview of the Canadian fintech landscape. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. So I think there's 2 questions on the chat actually. So the first question is, what government support is available for new fintech coming into Canada?
Yes, so there are a number of support programs for new fintechs coming into Canada, and that depends on the nature of the fintech and what the services are that the fintech is providing. But there's I mentioned the SHRED program, which is the Scientific Research and Development program. So if you wanted to note that down, and I can also maybe include, if helpful, actually, what we can do is we have the attendees. You've got the attendee information, right? Okay, so what I'll do is I'll send the slides, and then I'll also send the list of the government support for new fintech entrants. So you have that rather than me going through that. And then and I'll also send the information about our AI framework and the initiative for fintechs as well.
Okay, that would be really helpful for everyone, I guess. So I guess the last question on the chat currently is, where can we find the government AI framework and initiative for fintech? So would it be something similar to what you mentioned as well?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I'll send that as well too, rather than paste it into the chat, so everybody has access to it. So we'll provide that after the webinar together with the slides from this presentation.
Okay. I think we'll give a few more minutes to see if there's any more questions.
Yes, happy to address any questions.
Thanks for taking the time out to share with us. I think it's really very helpful, especially for our fintechs trying to expand into Canada as well.
Yes, yeah, no, my pleasure. I'm always happy to speak about Canada, notwithstanding I was coughing toward the end. Sorry about that. I think it might have been the way I drank my water.
I think there might be no other questions. So thank you everyone. Thank you, Ms. Suhuyini. If there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to us so we can connect you directly as well. Oh, there's another question.
What is this?
Can you share more information regarding the core banking system used by microfinance institution?
Sure. So if you're looking for, not microfinance, so our core bank, just to clarify, that's our, please also type into the chat if I've not answered your question, but our core banking system then would be the banks who are operating in Canada. So we have, they're considered to be Schedule I banks, and these banks are domestic banks in Canada. And there's really 5, but there's 6 of them who are considered to be our domestic they're the key banks. So if they ever failed, we would be in trouble. So those are these, the big five or big six, as some would refer to. And then we have foreign banks who operate in Canada with their foreign branches. And our banking laws, so as I mentioned, our banking system is very strong and sound, and it is resilient. And I just always emphasize that that's demonstrated with, the financial crisis. And then even just recently with the failures of Silicon Valley Bank and the other banks over the last couple of years, you can see that in Canada, like these laws are in place, for sound reason, especially given the position of the banks in our economy and in our country. So, anyways, you've got the domestic banks, the Canadian banks, and then there are foreign banks who have their branches here, and foreign banks have strict restrictions on how they can conduct activity here in Canada, from within Canada with approval, and also from outside of Canada. So when it comes to, I hope I'm answering your question there, when it comes to the core banking systems, that is what our banking system is. And then, of course, they're private lenders. And then even the insurance companies also lend money as well. And then there's also the access to the debt and rather the capital markets when it comes to equity or equity raises or IPOs or private placements. So there's a wide array of access to funding outside of the core banking system here. And just going to note too, if any, I think the slides have my name and my email addresses on our website. So happy to answer any additional questions if any arise after this session, or if I've not answered this question.
We'll wait for a minute or two.
Yes. I was going to say if they, yeah. I was just going to paste this so I can remember. Okay.
Okay, so I did address her question. Okay, if there's no further questions, thank you so much everyone for joining us this morning as well. And thank you for taking the time out.
Thank you, sir. I saw the clarification. Yeah, no, I figured that was it. Yeah. So, all right, yeah.
Thank you so much.
No, thank
everybody.
you. Yeah. No apologies. No, please. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it. So I will send, I'll get you the slides, and then I'm just going to paste that. Sorry, if you can just give me, I want to make sure I don't lose that. That was to make sure I give you the right information. There we go. I'm going to use this. Perfect. So I'll give you the list for the government support, and then also the government CI framework for FinTech. So I'll send that now so we can get that across to the participants.
Okay, no problem. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining this webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.